Well, good morning to you all. As Lenny has already said, we are kicking off a new series in the book of Esther. This series has been on our hearts here at BBC for, I think, since 2016. But every single year, we've always tried to do the book of Esther, and I've always found it somewhat a bit challenging to do. And we were supposed to have actually done it in April this year, and so we pushed it out thinking like, oh, we'll get to it sometime later. And here we are in the book of Esther, really looking forward to it this morning. And so this morning will be somewhat of an introduction just to set the scene for what we will be actually confronted with as we go through this book. A very difficult book to understand, but when you see the pieces of it being put together, you can see the work of God throughout this whole book. It was in my teenage years. It must have been one late evening. Not must have been. Was a late evening when I happened to walk past the kitchen and I overheard my dad speaking to my two sisters about an evening service that they had been attending at a local Baptist church, which intrigued me. The whole conversation just intrigued me so much. And so I wasn't a Christian at the time, but I was still sort of kind of restless about it in my life and searching for meaning and searching for something more in life. And so one piece of detail that evening just really struck me. And so if you were to ask me what else were they talking about throughout the conversation, I couldn't tell you up to this day, except for just that one piece of detail which I heard, which just really captivated my attention. And it was the fact that they were talking about an evening service at a church. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd grown up kind of thinking that Christians were people who weren't supposed to be out at night, right? Only sinners did that when gallivanting at night. And so hearing that not only these Christians were out at night, but actually having church in the evening blew my mind. Right up until that point, I telling you the truth, I'd never heard of such a thing in my life, that there was such a thing as evening's church. And so captivated was about the idea of an evening service that I decided, I'm going to go check this out, to see what are these Christians really doing at night, having church. And so I went along. Now, I'm sure many of us who are Christians here this morning would attest to our lives being full of circumstances and moments in life where at the time it seemed sort of kind of unassuming what had happened. But when you look back at it, you see God's providential hand at work through it all. My story of conversion is such a moment in my life. And so I just so happened to be walking past the kitchen that day. Picked up a stompy from a conversation that I wasn't a part of. And then it ultimately led to me being saved and then baptized at an evening service. I can only look back at that and see the work of God through all of that. That he was at work somehow through just normal, natural, seemingly unassuming event in the course of my life. Now, I don't know about you, but maybe you also have many circumstances and moments such as those. And in fact, I wonder what some of them have been like for your life. And so perhaps like me, your story of conversion is one too, where maybe it was through the instability of tough circumstances in your life, or the stability of a Christian home. Both of those kind of things could have happened in your life seemingly by chance, right? And yet they have proven effective in leading you to faith. Or perhaps it was a close encounter with death. And so whether it was through an accident or a disease, or even perhaps an act of crime, someone pulled a weapon on you and you thought that was it. And yet, here are you, here today, seated here with your life. Or maybe it's some addiction in the course of your life which could have wrecked your life that you somehow have avoided, even though you dabbled with things that you shouldn't have. On our lives, full of circumstances and moments, we can look back at how things panned out and actually see that God was at work through it all. Now, I'm not trying to say this morning that everything that has ever happened in your life has had a happy ending to it, which you can attribute to God. No, the reality is that also in our lives, there are moments and circumstances, which we can look back on and only see sorrow and pain as outcomes. Moments that leave us questioning, even to this day, was God even with me through it all? Moments that have proven somehow that human depravity, that is human brokenness, crookedness, sinfulness, has somehow prevailed, despite our efforts, or even at times despite God's, right? From our vantage point when we look into these things. And so life has got a way to get that real, doesn't it? Even for us, the people of God, as we look back on our lives. And so, as a Christian, you will have to look to steady this tension that you'll be confronted with in your life. Look to steady it. Look to find some sort of firm ground in it. Not to allow the depravity of your circumstances to rob you of your trust in God's providence. You have to look to steady that tension in life. Even when it seems like in real time that what God is up to isn't all that clear to you. And even if your own brokenness or depravity has led you to a particular jam in your life, to still somehow trust in the providence of God, that God is able, that He is able to work out all things in our lives to His glory and your ultimate benefit. That's the comforting hope we encounter in the book of Esther. And so for those of us who know a little bit about the book of Esther, it is full, right, of memorable moments and quotes throughout the book. But I want to suggest this morning that there is one pivotal, crucial point in the book of Esther upon which the rest of the narrative of the story revolves around. One pivotal moment upon which the ultimate meaning of the book, its message to us, what it wants to convey to us, actually hangs upon. And it is this moment in chapter 6, verse 1. On that night, the king could not sleep. On that night, the king could not sleep. Who's ever had sleepless nights before in their lives? Many of us, right? But on that particular night, the king could not sleep. Now that phrase seems somewhat unassuming, right? But so special about a king's sleepless night. But if you actually understand the book, survey the book of Esther, where what the author is actually doing up to this point in chapter 6, on that night, and then what happens following the sleepless night of the king, you will then realize how crucial this moment is to the story of the book of Esther, and most importantly, by whose providential hand did this moment come about. For the author of the book of Esther, up to this point, is building tension. He or she, we do not know who it is, building tension and building suspense in the story, in a sense, stacking the cards against the Jews, or with what has been happening throughout the story. And so Haman rises to power within the Persian court, and then the prejudice existing between Haman's lineage and that of Mordecai's escalates into Haman seeking prideful vengeance over the Jews because of Mordecai's disrespect towards him. And so what then the author shows in the early chapters of the book of Esther, a sequence of events that he builds up, which seems to actually be spelling the end for the Jews, that the destruction of the Jews is near. And so you'll see these sequences of events build up to a turning point, and then it begins to unravel. And so what happens first that is significant to note will be that having manipulated the king into actually trusting him, giving him his ring. Haman receives the king's ring and is thereby empowered with the full authority of the Persian Empire to actually annihilate the Jews. Then what comes next is he summons the scribes, the king's scribes, and then issues an edict to annihilate the Jews. And then letters are written with this edict, stamped with the king's ring of authority, and then sent out throughout the empire. And so all throughout the empire, it has then been decreed next that every single Jew, man, woman, and children, young and old, are to be killed on a single day in the month of Adar. And so as this edict is spread out throughout the empire, it is then publicized as law. Everyone can see it, which then leads to the next thing that you'll see in the story, the citadel of Susa being thrown into disruption, confusion and despair at the fact that the Jews are to be destroyed on this one day. And then ultimately, the last kind of momentous event to note in this whole build-up and suspense will be that Mordecai wears sackcloth and ashes, and then he goes out throughout the city mourning at this edict. And so up to this point, about chapter 4, you're kind of getting the sense that, sure, the Jews are destined to be destroyed. But then something happens. And as the story will then progress, the author is deliberate to show how what had been intended to destroy the Jews was not only halted, but then reversed. And so what you then see, whereas Mordecai wears sackcloth and ashes, now Mordecai is dressed in the king's robes. And then he's led throughout the city in great honor. Then the citadel of Caesar, will turn to rejoicing at the news that the Jews can now defend themselves through Mordecai's edict of defense, which was publicized as law, that the Jews could now defend themselves. And that edict allowed for all Jews throughout the whole empire to actually defend themselves against their enemies, including women and children. And Mordecai had summoned the king's scribes and issued this decree of defense, which is then written into letters that are sealed with the king's ring and then sent out throughout the empire. Also having started after Haman had been executed. And then what happens? The king gives Mordecai the same ring and empowers Mordecai to actually save the Jews. This point of reversal in the book of Esther is actually made clearer to us in the resolution that you find of the conflict near the book's end. And so in chapter 9, verse 1, here's what we read. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same. And so what day is that? That is the day that Haman's plot was meant to be carried out, annihilating all the Jews. When the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, what happens? The reverse occurred. The reverse occurred. the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them through Mordecai's decree of defense. The reversal occurred. And this point of reversal begins on the night of the king's sleepless night. On that night that the king could not sleep, something turned in the story that the author wants us to see, wants us to understand. And so come with me in Esther chapter 6 as we see this great turning point and what is beyond this great turning point in the story. So Esther 6, on that night, which night is that? Is the night after Queen Esther had invited, or the day after Queen Esther had invited Haman and the king to a banquet. On that particular night, the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king, presumably as lullabies. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus, who is Xerxes. Now, this laying on of hands is not the kind that we do up front here for prayer, right? And so what you'll read at the end of chapter 2 is that Mordecai discovered actually how these two eunuchs were actually plotting to assassinate the king. And so I told about their plot, and so it resulted in the king's life being spared. Verse 3, and the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him, which was a travesty. For according to Persian customs, a public reward was to be given for having shown loyalty. Verse 4, and the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the court, the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And so Haman couldn't wait any longer for that day in the month of Adar. No, he wanted Mordecai dead right away. And so he came to ask the king for his head. Verse 5, and the king's young men told him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And so out of his pride, Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, unaware that that will be him. And let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, unaware that that will be Mordecai. And let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. And so Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, the very man he came in that morning seeking to kill, and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. What a reversal of fortune, isn't it? And yet it doesn't end there. Look at the murder of verse 12. After all this, Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends, everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. And true as Bob, later that very day, at the second banquet that Esther throws for the king and Haman, Haman is exposed for having plotted to kill the queen, who unbeknown to him was a Jewess. As Esther goes on to explain in chapter 7 from verse 3 to King Xerxes, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Skipping to verse 5. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Skipping down to verse 9. Then one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai in his own house, Nochar. And so can you just imagine that turn of events, that reversal, that on the very day that Haman had come seeking to kill Mordecai, he himself is killed by the very means he had planned for Mordecai. And all this great reversal happened, started, sparked by seeming sleepless night in a king's life. On that night that the king struggled to fall asleep. And so here's our Bible commentator, Karen Jobs, as she puts it, the mighty Haman is rendered powerless by a chance event when the king just happens to have a sleepless night. He just happens to have the chronicles of his reign read to him. The story of Mordecai's loyalty just happens to come to his attention at the same moment when Haman just happens to be plotting Mordecai's death. And so what's happening in the story? Here's what the author of the book of Esther wants us to ask. Is the series of events, sequence of events that has happened in the story, just happen as a matter of chance and coincidence, or coincidence? Or is there a silent, unseen power beyond it all, providentially working for the ultimate benefit of his people. You see, here's what the author of this book has done so brilliantly for us. By making that point of reversal, that turning point in the story, seem like a chance event, seemingly unassuming event. What the author of the book is doing, without even needing to directly mention God to us, which he or she never does throughout the book, masterfully, is causing us to see and learn something all so important about the providence of God. Here's how Corin Jobs sums it up. This reinforces what happens here. The message that no one in the story, not even the most powerful person in the empire, Xerxes, is in control of what is about to happen. An unseen power is controlling the reversal of destiny. God is omnipotently present, even when most inconspicuously absent. And so in a book where God is not at all mentioned, not even once, we see his omnipotence. He brings about a great reversal for the good of his people. And so it leads us to this point. You have to conclude this, that our God is always at work, even when it seems like he is not. That our God is always at work, even when it seems like he is not. Now, here's where this truth already comes home into our realities, in how he looks to actually pastor and comfort us through our realities. Because this fortuitous reversal that brings about a rescue for the people of Israel in the book of Esther, through the inconspicuous providence of God at work in it all, took about 10 years to unfold from start to finish of the book. About 10 years for it to unfold throughout that whole story. Now just think about that for a moment. That is 10 years. 10 years of God seeming inconspicuous in the course of your life. 10 years of the work of God not seeming to be all that obvious to you. Of him going unnoticed in the background of your life. 10 years. There's so much that we can learn from that, right? Especially when you consider how the main characters of the book of Esther are actually portrayed to us. And so if you examine the main characters' conduct, including Esther's and Mordecai's, you'll discover great moral shortcomings and compromises throughout their lives. They are not portrayed to us as these flawless heroes. And so had they been portrayed as flawless heroes, then you and I will be tempted to do what we always do, right? Attribute their flawlessness to the presence of God in their lives. Isn't that what we always do? That I know that God must be with me. So because of us swimmingly, things seem to be going in my life, right? And then the opposite is start to become equally true, that I know that God must not be with me. So because of the failures and my shortcomings in life. And so who's never been tempted, right, to correlate the presence or absence of God in their lives by the current circumstances that they are facing? And so by portraying these main characters, it's not being blameless. It's not being these perfect heroes in the story. What is the author wanting us to see and come to grips with? He or she is revealing to us that our God is the kind of God who is determined to see His providence prevail despite human depravity. That's what He wants us to see. That He is the kind of God who is at work for so long unnoticed, omnipotently present in the kind of broken lives as we will see in the characters of the book of Esther, bringing about His redeeming purposes when all is said and done. And so our God isn't afraid to get His hands dirty in the lives of messy people. Often doing so unassumingly, quietly, and yet persistently through the course of time, bringing about His redeeming purposes in the fullness of time. And so what should that be saying to us? It should be saying this: listen, no matter how depraved your life may get, whether that is through your own depravity or brokenness, sinfulness, crookedness, or the depravity and brokenness or sinfulness or crookedness of someone else's. No matter how depraved the circumstances of your life may get, your God is more than able to reverse. The kind of trajectories that our own brokenness, that our own failures, or even our successes may actually set out for us. It's more than able to reverse that all. Such is the power and providence of our God. And so as we will journey over the next few weeks into this book and actually really see the depths of the depravity of the human heart when it comes to power, when it comes to pride, when it comes to prejudice, when it comes to privilege, remember this backdrop in it all. And it is this, that our God is always at work, even when it seems like He is not. And that His providence prevails despite our depravity. And with that as the backdrop, let's adopt a posture throughout the series, but then for the rest of our lives, which is the same kind of posture that we see the author of the book of Esther actually adopt throughout the book, models for us. And so two aspects about that posture. And so the first aspect of it is this, that don't despair over the messiness of people's lives, especially when their failures and sinfulness seems evident. Don't despair at that. How do we see that in the author? Throughout the whole book of the book of Esther, the author not once gives us their opinion or comments on the kind of brokenness and sinfulness that is clearly evident in this whole story. Remains silent through it all. And so what is the author doing? He's modeling to us the kind of humble patience we must adopt in life towards God's providence. That's what he's modeling to us. Because they will be scandalous, some of the things we'll see. And you could have an opinion at that, but they remain silent at that. Saying, listen, when it comes to the workings of God's providence in life, let us not be people who are quick to judge who will or will not see the redeeming purposes of God play out in their brokenness. Don't be quick to make that judgment. No. Trust it in the hands of the God who actually is able to prevail in the course of time against human depravity. And so then that means that as the people of God, we've always got to be a people who have a posture that looks, despite what we see, the brokenness that we see, that looks to try to steady ourselves in not allowing the current or present depravity we're seeing to rob us of our trust in God's providence. Steady yourself in there. God is able to use people's worst and best moments to His glory. and their ultimate benefit. And then the second aspect of the posture we must have is one that rests in gospel hope. We've got to rest in gospel hope. Because the restraint that we'll see that this author must have actually exhibited in not commenting, not once, on the kind of conduct that we will see in this book, must be speaking of a greater confidence they must have had in the fact that God's providence will prevail, despite despite human depravity. And so they're, again, modeling what they are calling us to do. Trust in the ultimate providence of God that unveils and prevails in the course of time. Now, the book of Esther does end on a good, happy note, where the Jewish people are saved and there's a festival. So it has a happy ending to it. But here's the thing. What do you do about all the depravity of the human heart that you will discover in that book when it comes to power, when it comes to the human heart and pride, when it comes to the human heart and prejudice, and when it comes to the human heart with the privileges that has been bestowed in life? What do you do with that depravity that we see in the book? Now, the author could have been tempted to sweep it under the rug for us, or paint a nice bow to it all. Again, silence at it all. And through that silence, here's what the author is doing. The author is trusting that somewhere in the providence of God, there will be a Christ who will come one day. And in that coming Christ, we will see the providence of God prevail despite the depravity that has gone unresolved in the story of the book of Esther. Now, that confidence in the Christ to come is our confidence today in the Christ who came and was crucified for our depravity, rose to life after the third day so that you and I can walk in the newness of being part of the covenant of the people of God. And he's interceding on our behalf in this new life. And so if you want to trust in the providence of God, it is a call for you to trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, in his person and in his work. That through the person of the Lord Jesus Christ and his ultimate work at the cross and his resurrection, we are a people who have seen God's providence prevail despite human depravity. So trust in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Come to Jesus Christ so that you would know of God's goodness, of God's grace, of the God who works out all things for the good of those whom he loves. He who did not spare his one and only son, but gave him up for us all. How would he not also, through him, give us all things? And so it is Jesus Christ in person and work that we want to remember this morning.